So I'm going to try and be really ambitious here. I've got a aunt in the UK who used to be married to an Italian, Lucio, who's no longer with us, who had the Italian bakery and confectionery in Avondale in Harare. He used to make the most amazing different shaped breads, and so my aunt is driving me crazy to bake a crocodile bread. So I very much doubt mine is ever going to look like a crocodile, but it will be some sort of spiky creature and the bread will be nice. So we're going to give it a bash anyway. I haven't got a lot of white bread flour left. I've got brown bread flour as well. So I'm going to use the bulk of it and hopefully get as much of my recipe in the white bread flour before I get to the brown. So I'm going to do 4 cups of flour. So I've got 3 and a bit. Sorry, that's my daughter asking me for a bread recipe from the UK. Okay, so that's 4. I think I'm going to make it 4.5 cups so that it's not quite so ridiculously little of brown flour. I never actually use a specific recipe for bread. I know that's very uncool, but I always just go by whatever I feel like quantity wise, and the bread is always great. So I'm just going to put in about a heaped teaspoon of salt, maybe a little bit more. And this Himalayan salt is not too salty, you know, it doesn't really freak the yeast out as much. But nevertheless, give it a good mix before the yeast gets into contact with it. So this just thins it out and saves the yeast. I've got 2 open packets of yeast. This is why I say I'm not really too fussed about the quantities that I use. So if you have 1 whole packet, use 1 whole packet of yeast. If you're going to use, this will probably be around 3/4 of a packet, maybe even half, I'm not sure. But if it's going to be less yeast, then what I do is I leave it for slightly longer to get a slightly longer rise out of it, and hope that that's going to be fine. So I'm going to scrounge in my cupboard and see if I don't have another half a packet somewhere. But this is also, when you're using little bits of yeast like this is when you should really be activating your yeast in a glass of water, blooming it, to check that it's okay. I'm not doing that because I've used this really recently and I know that the yeast is fine. If you find a package that's been sitting in your cupboard for 4 months or something and it's been opened, then always activate it, bloom it first separately, so that in fact you know that the yeast is active. So now I'm going to go and scrounge in my cupboard and see if I can come up with some more yeast. I don't have any more yeast, so I'm going to use this only, and I'm going to grab a little bit of my sourdough starter and put that in as well. So this is my sourdough starter, which if you look at it is bubbling beautifully. I'm just going to add a bit of that to this, which will help the bread rise. So this is really going to be an interesting loaf of bread. But I'm quite keen for you to see stuff like this because it's all thinking on your feet, you know, it's doing stuff that shows you how to get by in a kitchen where you can do all sorts of things to make a plan that you ordinarily wouldn't be able to do. So this is going to have about 2 really good glugs of olive oil. So 1, 2, there you go. And then I'm just going to use enough water to make a dough. And rather make the dough wetter than drier, in my opinion, because you can always make the dough drier by kneading with a bit more flour. But if it's too dry, it can be really hard to incorporate water back into that dough to make it a nice elastic dough. And I always feel that you have a much nicer crumb when your dough is more moist. I guess it gives it, you know, steam and inside and space to rise maybe. I don't know what the semantics of it are. Okay, cheers. So let's check this dough out. I probably put in about just over half a cup of water, and this is nice and moist. So it's sticky as you can see in the beginning. Needs to be worked a little bit. And I much prefer to work with dough that is this kind of wetness rather than a very firm dough. I'm going to give this a good knead for about 5 minutes to try and get the glutens working. It's already starting to feel less wet and sticky. So this is only sort of 3 minutes that I've been working this, and already you can see it's not as sticky. It's still tacky to the touch, but not wet like it was, and that's what you want. And I haven't added any more flour to this at all. So I'm stretching it out, turning it, and then pushing in the opposite direction. Stretching it out, bringing it back, turning it and pushing it in the opposite direction. That's my method anyway. Then I'm just going to scrape off the stuff that's stuck to my hands and give it another go. So this is now beautifully smooth and elastic. Still slightly tacky to touch, but by no means wet. I'm going to leave this to prove now, so I'm going to put a little bit of oil in the bottom of this. Roll it around. So that it doesn't get a hard skin and can't rise, so otherwise it'll just prevent it from rising. And then I'm going to put a lid on there and leave that for about an hour to rise. Well, hopefully it might even take longer because I'm a bit short on the instant yeast and I've sort of added some of my sourdough starter to it. Okay, so my crocodile's looking a little bit like a coelacanth or something. So I'm going to let it rise now and see what happens. I might have to cut these spiky things to make them sort of spikier, but we'll see how this works out. Right, the time has gone off for 30 minutes. Let's see my coelacanth crocodile. Like a barbel. It's hilarious. Sorry, Diana, it's not quite a crocodile, but I will try again, but it's fun. I mean, you can make all sorts of lovely shapes, get your kids involved, and of course, once it rises, as you can see, you know, it's going to change a little bit. So mine actually does look a little bit like a barbel. However, it is an animal shape. Definitely not a crocodile. Okay, but the bread will be lovely. And it's fun.